To preface this review and to give a little bit of backstory and history for me with Guy Ritchie films, I must say I've watched every single Guy Ritchie thing at least one time, and that includes the very brand new Netflix series, The Gentleman. Now, Guy Ritchie has started his career with Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. I believe that was 1999. He followed that up with Snatch, and then Swept Away, Revolver, Rock and Rolla, the Sherlock Holmes duo film, King Arthur, the live-action Aladdin, The Gentleman, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and as stated, The Gentleman TV series on Netflix now, which 90% of what Guy Ritchie has made, I absolutely fucking love. Everything that I like from Guy Ritchie is fucking magnificent. Now, with that being said, the other 10% that I don't love from Guy Ritchie, I really fucking hate. That being Swept Away, Revolver, and especially the live-action Aladdin. Now, I didn't put out a review for the Gentleman TV series, but I discussed it with people when it first released and I watched it. The Gentleman TV series, in a short synopsis, is not at all like the film, but it's still a pretty good Netflix series. It's pretty funny throughout. It's consistently tonally good. The story is decent enough. Guy Ritchie wrote and directed the first 2 episodes and then handed it off to a room of writers and directors, and that's fine. The Gentleman TV series, I would have probably given that a 7 out of 10, whereas the film, as an overall audience, I gave it an 8, but personally, I would give the Gentleman film a 10, because it's a lot like Lock, Stock, and Snatch and Rock and Rolla, where the storylines are super fucking complex and you absolutely have to pay attention to his gangster comedy stories, or you will be completely, utterly lost. And that's mainly why I don't really care for Swept Away, Revolver, and the live-action Aladdin, because they were either... King Arthur is another one I don't really care for, but that's only because I've heard nothing but awful things about that film. I personally never watched that, but I've heard just non-stop zeros from everybody else. But Swept Away, Revolver, the live-action Aladdin, I don't like those because they're just stupid. There's nothing Guy Ritchie about them at all. I mean, Revolver kind of has the complex direction style, but it's just scattershot and just ends up being a cheap, muddled down story. Another great from Guy Ritchie that you wouldn't have expected, that I honestly absolutely loved, because it's kind of more of a big budget film, but also an interpersonal story. But it's not really a Guy Ritchie film at all, even though he did write and direct it. And that's The Covenant last year, which starred Jake Gyllenhaal, the military story. And I love that film. So out of, 8 films, I strongly disliked 3, and I absolutely fucking loved all of the other ones. Now, 2024, we get another new Guy Ritchie film. Operation Fortune. Can't forget about that one. What I have to say about Operation Fortune Rue de Guerre was I liked it, but I didn't like that they didn't really delve into the character's problems. Like, Jason Statham's character randomly brings up at the beginning that he has allergies, and I think there's only one minor scene in that film where they actually play that up, but then it ends up just being a generic spy action film. It's still good, but it's nowhere near Ritchie's best. Now, there's Guy Ritchie's The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which stars Henry Cavill, who I absolutely fucking love as an actor, no matter what he's in. I always love Henry Cavill. Even with his shitty acting in The Man from U.N.C.L.E., he still did his part superbly, I would say. Yes, his lines were delivered kind of and incoherently, but he still did his part, I would say. I would say that's more so just the structuring of his acting within the film. Then we get Henry Golding, who comes back from The Gentleman. He's in this film. The dude that plays Jack Reacher in the Reacher Amazon series, which I never watched that, but I do enjoy the first Jack Reacher film. And then we get a couple other actors that I recognize, but I don't remember from where or what their names are. But the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, I can tell you right now, will be strongly compared to Inglourious Basterds by Quentin Tarantino in 2009, because essentially they're kind of the same thing, whereas the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare is actually based on a true story, and Inglourious Basterds is more of like fan fiction within the Nazi-dom and all of that. But nevertheless, those two will definitely get strongly compared, and I get it. Personally, I like both of those films. If I had to choose which one is greater, I would probably have to say Inglourious Basterds, just by a hair, because Inglourious Basterds, Quentin Tarantino has a great way of being able to flesh out the good and bad characters, and they're not to be rooted for if they're bad, but you understand their story. Whereas the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, yes, Guy Ritchie wrote the bad guys out, sort of, like the main bad guys. He sort of wrote them out to where you're understanding their storyline, but essentially at the end of the day, all of the big bad Nazi guys in the Ministry are basically just Nazis. And don't get me wrong, I'm super pro-America, I'm super anti-Nazi. I do fully agree with that, but as a film critic, I am a firm believer that every character should have a minute to shine at the very least, as far as backstory, history, character development, and the like. Now, there are some touching parts that Guy Ritchie used to flesh out the main bad guys a little bit. But overall, the Nazis in the Ministry are basically just Nazis. There are some smart scenes that some Nazis do that are actually wittily written, but ultimately the Nazis are Nazis. Now, the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare is an action comedy written and directed by Guy Ritchie and produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, who produced a shit ton of big budget films. And I think that was probably the best pairing that they could have done for this film, because it allowed Guy Ritchie to make his film and not have to worry about the budget, I guess. He left it to somebody that's actually good at doing that job. And the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare is a solid, very good film. It is super well written, and I mean, the parts where there are charismatic lines to be said, not just from Henry Cavill and the like, but everybody in the scene, they are delivered basically perfectly. This film is just as funny as the likes of Lock, Stock, and Snatch and Rock and Rolla. Although this isn't really, it's really funny because this film is a military story, but it's also kind of a gangster comedy, like yet another one, just because it's within the military and it's within the World War II, but it's about a band of misfits that they kind of get along with each other, and they're kind of witty back and forth and witty with everybody else. And that's another thing where Henry Cavill strongly shines in. It's charismatic writing. And again, that's why I love him as an actor, because he himself is very charismatic. And I just firmly believe Henry Cavill and Guy Ritchie are like a super perfect pair-up for films. And the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare's plot, they could have taken the simplistic route and just made it about the misfits. But they didn't just make it about the misfits. They made it about their commanders, even parts of the Nazis, because they're involved in the scheme. And another subplot that intertwined with the misfits scheme. And it ends up being 3 or 4 different storylines that mesh into one by the very end of the film. And it works out because this is yet another Guy Ritchie film where you should pay attention or you might get lost. there are snippets of scenes where they'll announce one thing at one part in the film, and if you didn't catch it, you'll be completely lost what they're going to do in the next scene or what they're going to try and accomplish. Now, this isn't necessarily Guy Ritchie's best film by any means. This is a very witty, very funny, very good action comedy, or even military gangster comedy, honestly. But I would say that this is, I'd say, the third pedestal degree for Guy Ritchie films, whereas the top tier, definitely Lock, Stock, Snatch, Rock and Roller, The Gentleman. And then the second, I would say, like, The Covenant. Even though I wouldn't go out and tell people, oh, Guy Ritchie, oh yeah, The Covenant. But The Covenant is an excellent, amazing film, nevertheless. The third tier, I would say, is The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, where it's really good. But Inglourious Basterds and Quentin Tarantino kind of beat Guy Ritchie and them to the punch, with the exception that Guy Ritchie's story is actually fully based on true stories of what happened and what these misfits accomplished. Basically, they were the heroes at the end of World War II that basically swayed World War II from the Nazis winning. And that's what I really like about this film, on top of the witty writing, but that's just essential Guy Ritchie right there. Overall, for me, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare is not the greatest Guy Ritchie, but it's definitely a superb Guy Ritchie film, and this is one of those Guy Ritchie films I would strongly recommend nevertheless, even though it's kind of a been there, done that plot, but it's based on a true story, and that's another one that gives its merit. So overall for me, The Ministry is wittily written, superbly directed, especially with the subplots and the main storyline interweaving together throughout the film, and really makes it feel like a complex film, much like Lock, Stock, and Snatch, even though this is a military film, and usually military films are simplistic, go get bad guys, but this is not really the case. So again, overall for me, The Ministry, I would say I'm really stuck between a 7 and an 8. I want to say that this is a 7 because at the end of this film, it shows the pictures of the Misfit team and who all was involved in this story. And honestly, especially Henry Cavill's character, the casting was like super off. Don't get me wrong, the casting for the film was phenomenal. But the casting for the characters that were in real life, they look nothing like the actors in the film, especially Henry Cavill and the actual Gus March Phillips. So I'm just going to leave The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare at a 7 out of 10, mainly because of that. Thank you.